And every president, from when I joined the CIA, and George H.W. Bush had just become president, the Israelis asked us to bomb Iran. Every single president. No matter who the prime minister of Israel happens to be, you got to bomb Iran. You got to bomb Iran. You got to bomb Iran. And every single president said, no, we're not bombing Iran. I remember a couple of times when Obama and Netanyahu got into shouting matches.
Oh, yeah.
We didn't have an understanding or an appreciation of what an existential threat Iran was or a nuclear Iran was. You got to bomb Iran. You got to bomb Iran. We would never bomb Iran because our position was that that would be the start of World War III. Because if we bomb Iran and maybe weaken the hold that the government has on the country, then the Chinese may have to come in or the Russians may have to come in.
That was going to be my next question. Did this just prove that this situation, seeing as we did bomb sites there and nothing happened, did this prove that the Chinese and the Russians actually don't really give a shit about Iran, or is that a little premature to say?
Maybe just a little premature, but I would say as things stand right now, yeah, that's the initial conclusion we can draw. The reason, though, I'm told, that Donald Trump decided to bomb Iran was that the Israelis said, for the first time, if you don't bomb Iran to take out these deep bunkers, we're going to use nuclear weapons. And they had never threatened that before. And so Trump said, bombing Iran might actually save us from the start of World War III if it keeps the Israelis from using nuclear weapons.
So according to your source, the Israelis told the president of the United States that if he did not use the United States military power to bomb the nuclear facilities in Iran, Israel, acting on its own, would use nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Do you see why there's a problem with that statement, John?
Yeah.
Because they've never admitted that they've had them.
That's right.
So you're telling me that they just admitted to the president of the United States that they have nuclear weapons and we still do not have them in the IAEA treaty?
I mean, if Israeli nuclear whistleblowers are to be believed, yeah, they've had them. They started working on them in the 50s. They got him around the late 60s or the early 70s. Look at Mordechai Vanunu. Mm-hmm. You know, he wasn't charged for treason for nothing.
That's the guy who they hit in Rome with the honeypot?
Yeah.
Yeah, 86?
No, he friended me on Facebook. I rejected the friend request. In 86, yeah, they got him in 86.
That's right. He friend requested you on Facebook?
Yeah, and I was like, yeah, no thank you. I have enough problems in my life. I was on Piers Morgan's show a couple of months ago, and I'm on with a retired Mossad general, Danny Ayalon, thank you. So Alan Dershowitz was on.
Oh, God.
And I just can't help myself sometimes when Alan Dershowitz and I are in the same room. I just can't help it. He's just such... On the one hand, he's a very kind and generous man. On the other hand, when it comes to Israel, he's irrational.
How so?
There's literally nothing that the Israelis can do that's wrong. Nothing. And he won't let you get a word out. If he thinks that you might possibly criticize Israel, he's going to interrupt you until you just give up and move on. So I'm arguing with him about whether or not Israel spies on the United States. I said, of course they spy on the United States. They're prolific in their espionage work in the United States, especially as it relates to American defense contractors, right? Finally interrupts Dershowitz and asks General Ayalon if it's true that the Israelis spy on the United States. And he just laughed. He goes like that. And he says, my position is whatever the prime minister's position is. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you for confirming that Israel spies on the United States. It's the same thing with the nuclear program. Pierce came right out and asked him, does Israel have nuclear weapons?
And what did he say?
And he said, well, the prime minister hasn't confirmed that there are nuclear weapons, so I'm just going to go with what the prime minister says. One other thing, too. I have a friend. He was my first boss at the CIA. He's a really, really great guy. He retired years ago.
John Brennan?
No, he's not a really great guy. So in his retirement, he writes books about these little niche foreign policy issues that you might say, well, who gives a shit about that? And then you read the book and you can't put it down. Like U.S.-Indian relations during the Kennedy administration. I couldn't put the book down. Or some obscure little window in the 70s of U.S.-Saudi relations, stuff like that. So anyway, he told me that, like we all do, he sent his book into the CIA's Publications Review Board for clearance before he sent it to the publisher. And he said that in all the books he's written at least a half a dozen, they only took out 3 words, Israeli nuclear program. And I said, why? It's not up to us to protect the fact that there's an Israeli nuclear program. We didn't classify any Israeli nuclear program. That was improperly classified. And he said, yeah, I knew it, but then I thought, it's easier just to take it out. The Iranian government has practiced a policy called strategic patience. That's what they've described it as in the Iranian media, strategic patience. And that's manifested itself in a couple of different ways. When the Israelis first attacked, the Iranian response was to not strike back. And then the Israelis attacked a second time. And the Iranian response was to send drones. Drones move very slowly. And so the Iranians actually warned the Israelis in advance, we're sending drones. Almost all of them were shot down. Something like 7 got through, which is a learning experience because it shows that the Iron Dome's not perfect, even against slow motion drones. Then the Israelis, killed essentially the entire Iranian military leadership, just took them all out. You know how they did that?
Very precise strikes, by the way.
Very, very precise.
They didn't miss.
Not that they even needed to be precise, because the Israeli policy is, if they want to kill you and you're in an apartment block, they'll take the entire city block out and kill 2,000 people if they think they can get you.
That's a policy they
That's
have?
a policy. And that's why Hezbollah, for all intents and purposes, no longer exists. It will again in 6 months.
Is it like an attitude that their military has to say, "F it, we're going to do whatever we want"?
Oh, it's
or is
higher
it
than
an
the
actual
military.
written policy?
It's from the Israeli political leadership.
Wow.
Yeah. So what they did is there are hundreds of thousands of Afghan refugees in Iran, right? They'll never get Iranian citizenship. And because they don't have paperwork, they're not entitled to free medical, to food aid, welfare, nothing. And they're desperate. Well, those are the guys that the Israelis recruited. It's like, we want you to stand on this corner. And every time you see this general drive by, make a note of it and then transmit it back to us. Here's $100. They recruited thousands of these guys.
How would could you walk me through some common tactics and ways that they would recruit someone like that?
Yeah,
where are they meeting them? How are they meeting them?
Sure. This is an easy recruitment that any, brand new case officer can do. It's essentially a cold pitch, but you're cold pitching someone who's so desperate that they'll do anything. There's no love of Iran among these Afghans because the Iranians haven't given them anything. There's no hatred of Israel because maybe these guys don't even know it's the Israelis that are asking them to work. They could be saying, oh, we're from the Mujahideen Khalq, MEK, or we're from Iraq, or we're from, Pakistan or whatever. They don't have to say we're Israeli intelligence officer. And then what they end up getting is, jobs in these generals' houses as a tea wala, a tea boy. Or
that could mean a few things.
Sweep the floor, and oftentimes it does mean a few things. Sweep the floors, wash the car, whatever. Then you get the general's cell phone number. Well, we know that the Israelis targeted each individual's cell phone number so they could track it as it's moving around town and fire rockets directly at whoever happens to be holding the cell phone. So the Iranian government then said, as a new policy, no generals and no nuclear scientist can carry cell phones. So you know what the Israelis did? Because the Israelis ended up killing them all.
What'd they do?
They realized that the Iranians never told the bodyguards that they can't carry cell phones. Would lead to something terrible was when we decided to bomb Iran at the Israelis' behest. The bottom line, too, is there's going to have to be an independent Palestine. There just has to be, because the current situation's untenable. Yeah. The Israeli press has been talking a lot over the last several weeks, maybe over the last month, about an idea where Israel would technically continue to own Gaza, but the day-to-day life of Gaza would be administered by Saudi Arabia, which would also then invest in things like an electrical grid, water desalination plants, a port. Yeah, and it would have to be disarmed. There would have to be no Palestinian military. Great, right? It's a great idea. And I've said it a couple of times in podcasts. In 1991, I was on my very first overseas tour in Saudi Arabia, brand new CIA officer. And I was working for an ambassador who really became legendary, Chaz Freeman. He went on to be ambassador to China and assistant secretary of defense. The guy is brilliant. He floated the idea with the Saudis. What if we were to ask you to build a port and an airport and a water desalination plant and an electrical grid? And they said, yeah, we would do it in Gaza. And then we went to the Israelis, and the Israelis said, absolutely never. That was 1991. And before October 7th, they only had but 5 hours of water every day. Then the Israelis would shut it off. They would have a few hours of electricity. Then the Israelis would shut it off. The situation's untenable because another October 7th is going to happen if there's not a sort of a pressure release valve. What was it Martin Luther King said? Never underestimate a man's desire to be free. Well, they've got to concede something.
There is no better intelligence service on earth than the Mossad. They are the best. Even at the CIA, we used to just shake our heads in wonderment sometimes at some of the things that the Mossad accomplished. The pager operation, just for a moment. I gave an interview to a Russian network after this operation, and the questions were completely loaded. Like, isn't this a crime against humanity? Yes. Well, should they be punished? And I said, you have to understand from the perspective of an intelligence officer, this plan was a stroke of genius. Can you imagine the work that went into reverse engineering the supply chain for pagers? Not only do you have to identify what kind of pagers Hezbollah's leadership is using, but you have to reverse engineer the entire supply chain, either take over manufacturing or intercept the manufactured pieces, load bombs or plastique or whatever they used into every single unit, making sure that they continued to work properly, and then have them distributed to the right people once they got to Lebanon. This had to be years in the making, and it had to be an operation where literally everything went right at every step of the way. So when I hear reports that they used falsified communications to essentially lure the Iranian intelligence leadership to one location so they could hit it and take them out, absolutely, I believe it 100%. They're that good.
How are they that good for such a small country?
Because they can't lose. If they lose, they cease to exist. You know, in the United States, sometimes you do something stupid, you make a stupid decision, or your policymakers make a stupid decision, and you end up being bogged down in a conflict like Afghanistan that lasts for 20 years. Okay, you learn a lesson, you move on. If the Israelis lose, they cease to exist, and so they can't lose. They'll do literally anything to ensure victory. That's why we toss around terms like war crimes or crimes against humanity. Yes, oftentimes they are war crimes or crimes against humanity. And yes, in a perfect world, they would be prosecuted in some international venue. But they're not, because they don't care what the rest of the world thinks. It's all about survival. I had a conversation with a former CIA colleague of mine just a few days ago. We talked about that. And I said, the balls that the Israelis have, they've essentially moved intelligence operations into Iran proper and set up like they own the place. And he said, that's the thing. It's so gutsy that even the Iranians probably thought, well, nobody would have the guts to actually come here and open up a factory, right? But the Israelis did. The Israelis did. One of the first things that I said, as soon as the first wave of Israeli missiles were flying, was that the Israelis have an incredible network of spies in Iran, a network that dwarfs what any of us had previously thought. And conversely, the Iranians have to clean up their society because they are utterly and totally infiltrated by Israeli intelligence. Oh my God, yes. There's a famous Israeli story where in the 1960s, the Mossad hired a guy. He had volunteered actually to join Mossad, and he didn't make the cut. But it turned out that his Arabic was so good, it was native Arabic, unaccented Arabic, that they later approached him and said, hey, remember you tried to apply with us? We have a job for you. They sent him to Syria with money and secure communications. He so ingratiated himself with the Syrian leadership that in 1965, he was considered for the position of Deputy Minister of Defense of Syria. And the whole time, he's an Israeli citizen. He's Jewish, pretending to be a Syrian Arab. And he's reporting back to Mossad. He made a mistake one night. The Russians secretly went to the Syrians and said, you've got a mole. We're not sure who it is, but there's a mole. And so the Russians triangulated his transmissions and they were able to narrow it down to a couple of houses. The Syrians finally raided the house and arrested him, and he was hanged in the public square. But he's a great hero in Israel today. What's his name? Eli Cohen, something like that. His widow is still living. But this is what the Israelis do. When I was at the CIA, the Israelis did an operation that was just brilliant. This is the period where, you wanted to move a satellite. It would take 6 months to move the satellite, right? And the Israelis really, really wanted to know what was going on in the port of Benghazi. And so an Israeli intelligence officer called the harbor master in Benghazi and said, "Hi, I'm a French businessman, and I represent the interests of a group of other French businessmen. And because we invest so much money, we need to know exactly what ships are in port and what the bills of lading say. So we're looking for somebody we could hire as a consultant. Do you know anybody that would like to be a consultant? Because we have so much money, we can pay pretty much anything." And the harbor master, of course, says, "Yeah, I'll be a consultant for you." And they said, "Okay, we're going to call you every morning. And then you tell us which ships are in port and you tell us everything that the ship is carrying." And so he did. And this went on for years. And they would wire some money into his account, every few days. And they didn't need to move satellites. They didn't need to infiltrate the harbor master's office on the ground. They already had the harbor master himself. And so for years, they knew when Syrian ships were in Benghazi, when they had weapons or ammunition on them. They had everything they ever wanted. And all it took was a phone call. That was it. Iranian relations with Russia and China are far, far closer than they have been at any other point where the U.S. and Iran have faced conflict. As you said correctly, Iran's a member of BRICS now. That's a big deal. Iran falls under the Russian nuclear umbrella. That's also a big deal that we didn't have to deal with in the past. China's the wild card here for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Chinese, Tibet aside, the Chinese generally do not have an imperialist foreign policy. They've had little border skirmishes with the Vietnamese, a couple of skirmishes with the Indians, but they're generally not one to project military power abroad. They have one permanent military base overseas, which, crazy as it might sound, they share with the United States. That's Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. So on the face of things, I wouldn't expect the Chinese to commit troops or planes or anything like that. I would expect them to commit troops, but not combat troops, troops to replace Iranian troops. Let's say the Iranian government's in danger of falling. I could see the Chinese sending, we'll call them peacekeeping troops for the purpose of this conversation, that would free up Iranian troops to go fight the fight. I could see that happening. But I think that the more immediate threat to the West would be from Russia. If the Russians aren't overextended in Ukraine, then it's a possibility they could do something more substantive to help the Iranians. If you look, the border with Afghanistan is essentially unprotected. It's too rugged, it's too mountainous, it's too much of a desert. You just can't control that gigantic a border. In Baluchistan, so we're talking about southeastern Iran and southwestern Pakistan, not only is that border almost impossible to protect, but it's also where separatist groups live on the Pakistani side. And so smuggling is a very big problem. But smuggling is also a problem in the Gulf. It's something that I saw myself. You would think that it would be utterly protected and protectable in the Gulf because the Gulf countries are so advanced and so sophisticated. But if you go out, you walk every morning to the harbor in Kuwait City, for example, or in Manama, the capital of Bahrain, or even in Dubai or Sharjah, which are both right on the water. And you see hundreds and hundreds of dhows. Dhows, DHOWS, are those old style wooden boats that are common in the Persian Gulf. And normally you see them docked in the morning with fruits and vegetables and fish and shrimp. And they're just independent fishermen, smugglers, but fishermen selling their wares early in the morning. Well, nobody even bothers to inspect those boats. Nobody bothers to pay any attention to them. And so how easy would it be to put drones on them or to put missiles? I would venture to say it would be very easy, and it would complement the smuggling operations that are taking place in places like Baluchistan, for example. So if the Iranians are worried about smuggling and they're focused on Baluchistan with this strange separatist group, Baluchistan People's Liberation Army, whatever it's called, they're attention is diverted from the Gulf. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if some of those things got in right under their noses from the Gulf, that such an attack was occurring. But I'll tell you something that the Israelis do. The United States does not work hand in glove with the Israelis at all times, contrary to popular belief. When I was still in the CIA, my last job at headquarters was as executive assistant to the CIA's deputy director for operations. And we were preparing to fight the Iraq war. We were preparing to cross the border in the coming days. So this is 4 or 5 days before we actually initiated hostilities. And the Israelis came to us and said, we really want to be a part of this attack. And we said, absolutely not. There can't be any Israeli involvement, especially on the ground. It'll unify the Arabs against us. You have to stay out of it. Well, within 24 hours, all of Iraq's electrical towers in the western desert began tipping over. These were, we've all seen electrical towers that go for miles and miles and miles, and you see the cables running along the top. The ones in Iraq had 3 legs, right? So 3 legs, let me turn my hand there like that. 3 legs to keep them up. The Israelis would blow up 1 leg and the tower would tip over. And I remember the deputy director saying, those damn Israelis, we told them to stay out of it. But they so wanted to attack Iraq, just in a small way, just to be a part of it, that they disregarded everything that we said. So I think in this case, they wouldn't have wanted to really anger the United States. We had already told them we wouldn't attack Iran for them. But I think they probably gave us a heads up that this was coming. And usually a heads up like that comes 3, 4, 5 hours before the actual event.
Why wouldn't they listen to the US? That's surprising to me. I thought the US had a lot more influence over Israel, considering the support, their biggest ally. They're supporting them a lot in the UN, but also militarily and financially.
A lot of it has to do with Benjamin Netanyahu as a person, as a leader. Netanyahu is incredibly arrogant and believes that not only does he know better than every American president, but that because he lives it every day, that he lives in this dangerous neighborhood called the Middle East, that he understands better than any American president could understand. And it infuriates him that president after president after president has refused to attack Iran on behalf of Israel. And so I think that he calculated that if he acted unilaterally, the United States eventually would be forced into moving into Iran to support the Israeli position. And we might even get there. Donald Trump is so hard to read because he'll say one thing and then he'll say exactly the opposite thing, sometimes an hour later, sometimes in the same sentence. And so you really don't know what American policy is. And I think that Netanyahu believes that he can influence whatever that policy ends up being.
Interesting. But do you think Trump is genuinely looking for a peace deal right now, or that ship has sailed? Here are these messages. You've got Israel talk about potential regime change and operation, I think, the Rising Lion, and potentially targeting Khamenei, and they targeted the chief negotiator as well. So if they're looking for negotiations, shouldn't he be the only one that is left alive, even more important than the supreme leader? Not as important, but second after the supreme leader, if they're looking for a deal.
I think the latter is probably the case. I have a friend at the White House who told me to never underestimate Donald Trump's desire to win a Nobel Peace Prize. He's still angry that Barack Obama has a Nobel Peace Prize. And that's why he initiated talks with the North Koreans, for example. That's why he keeps talking about a grand deal. That's why he said that he could influence the Russians into ending the Ukraine war within 24 hours of taking the oath of office. None of those things have happened yet. But I think he really is optimistic about some grand deal that is going to make him the peacemaker of the Middle East. Now, if there is some kind of a deal, it's going to be with a rump Iran. Maybe it's going to be with some temporary government that takes over after the collapse of the present one. Who knows? Who knows what it's going to look like? But I think he really believes he can make a deal and he should be rewarded for it.